Well, okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar presented by Trisotech in partnership with Stephen White from BPM Advantage. Um, so we'll just do a quick introduction to let you all get in and settle and get ready so that we're all set for Steve's presentation in just a few minutes. So for those of you who don't know Steven, he is an independent consultant for his company, which is called BPM Advantage Consulting. He's working with clients to define business and process architectures, internal standards, and training material, and works on process improvement, methodology, and approaches. Steven is sometimes described as the father of BPMN, with over 25 years of process modeling experience, ranging from modeling pilot workload to commercial business processes. And he has been involved in most aspects of business process modeling software. In the last few years, he has been active in the development of business modeling standards. He was the primary editor of BPMN 1.0 and BPMN 2.0 specifications. So when we talk BPMN practice, tooling, and standards development, Stephen is definitely a world-class reference. And for those of you who don't know me, which means probably most of you, I'm Jonathan, and I'm leading the communications and marketing department here at Trisotech. So just important to notice that the model development approach that you will witness in this webinar was made using Trisotech's Digital Enterprise Suite. That's the software that you will see in action in just a few seconds. If you have any questions regarding the technology that is used or the tool itself, I'll invite you to send me an email or to just reply to the follow-up email that I will send you after the webinar, somewhere before the end of the week. So who are we at Trisotech, and what's the Digital Enterprise Suite? Well, we're a solution provider. Our software is called the Digital Enterprise Suite. It's a cloud-based software that helps businesses in their digital transformation efforts. So we're covering pretty much the whole modeling spectrum, ranging from strategic planning and strategic modeling all the way to operational modeling. The Digital Enterprise Suite is a unique tool that can help your organization become not only more efficient and effective in the way it does business, but also more agile in delivering and improving customer experience. So what you will see today is an overview of the many ways the software can help you improve how things get done in your organization using Stephen's methodology. As you see at the bottom of the screen, the suite is a tool set of components. They are integrated in one another. So they're all bringing value on their own, but they bring even more value when they're used together. So that's it. Enough from me. Let's go to Steve's presentation. And don't forget to send your questions using the questions area of the GoToWebinar widget. So we will respond to them in the Q&A part at the end. So Steve, the audience is all yours.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan. Okay, so Jonathan already did the introduction, so we'll just kind of jump right into the main topic, which is looking at this OMG Healthcare BPM project and the approach we took in that project and the models we created using the Trisotech tools and so forth. So this project, sponsored by the OMG, began almost a year ago. So in the OMG meeting in Coronado last December, it was kicked off. And the main purpose of this project is to develop a field guide for healthcare organizations. And this field guide will help these organizations or related entities develop detailed, reusable clinical pathway models. So a clinical pathway is basically an important medical situation or problem that needs to be handled. In this case, we're talking about antenatal care or pregnancy, but it could be a surgery or a pharmacy process and so forth. So any related medical processes or behaviors that need to be modeled. We call them clinical pathway within this domain. And also, people who use the field guide would be able to understand and consume the clinical pathways developed by other organizations, and they could take those pathways and implement them in their own organization. And at the same time, as this work has been going on, we've been developing a detailed use case on antenatal care in conjunction with the field guide. So the field guide is used to help develop these kind of examples, and we also use this example to help tailor and formalize the field guide, so that we kind of did these two projects together. Both of them are ongoing, so we haven't finished the field guide yet. We'll have a beta draft in the next OMG meeting in a couple weeks, and we're still developing this antenatal care, but we do have a lot of content, at least in terms of this particular example. And so I'll be presenting the antenatal use case and the approach taken to develop those models in the context, and we did use the Trisotech tool suite to do that. One thing I won't be doing is defining or explaining the standards that we're using. So we used 3 standards: BPMN, CMMN, and DMN. So I'm not going into any details on how those models are used and so forth. I'm just assuming that people have at least some basic understanding of that. So given the time that we have, I'm just going to go into the project itself. So antenatal care. So why this particular approach, or why this particular example? For one, it had a well-defined start and end. From the very first appointment, the pathway would start until delivery of the baby. And we did not, at least in this case, include the delivery process, or postnatal care was not included in the models that we were creating. And this is a complicated process, or at least it can be, since it does stretch over 9 months and a lot of different things can happen. But so, at least for the example that we've been creating, we've been focusing kind of on the happy path and a few exceptions. So there are many potential complications that we haven't defined in our model yet. So the model that I'm going to show is pretty complex, but it's going to expand as we handle more of the exceptions. So let's look at the overall scope of this use case. As we began developing, and I'll describe the kind of the methodology here. It's fairly simple, but as I said, it is complex, and there was a lot of different models that interacted to create this use case. And as you can see, there are, at this point, 22 BPMN process models, 9 CMMN case models, and 17 DMN decision models, all as part of this clinical pathway, or this whole topic of antenatal care. These models are all connected in some way or another. So one process might be called from another, and you have a case CMMN model that calls another process because you need to do some processes from there, and then there are decisions that can happen at multiple times throughout the process. So we'll look at that. So I'm going to show you a diagram here. I don't want us to focus too much on the structure or what the meaning of this diagram is. The general idea here is just to give you an idea of the scope. So this is a lot of content. And so I'll just describe what the elements are of this. So the blue shapes represent a process model. And some of them could be sub-process models here as well. But so there's 22 or so of those around the different diagram. They're interconnected. And the little suitcase objects are the cases. So at the very top, we have a case, and then there are cases that can happen throughout the model. And then the table elements are the decision or DMN models that are connected to this overall case. So you can see, without looking at this, this is not a process flow or anything. It's just a set of all the different models and the connections between them. And so that's all just showing the overall scope. And that's basically what I wanted to show, what we developed in the context here. So it is quite a large set of models, all interacting, all part of the same use case. So let's start looking at the approach we took and some of the models, and I can actually switch to the actual tool. We can look at some of the models as they look like, but here let's kind of review what we did and how we did it. So the first thing we did is create a kind of a high-level model of the entities and the relationships. This is using the Discovery Accelerator tool in Trisotech. And I'll show an example of that in just a sec. But this model also serves as kind of a glossary or vocabulary for that pathway. And you'll see why this is important in a few minutes. But first, we developed that high-level model and the relationships. And then from that high-level model, we created a set of BPMN and CMMN models, and also created DMN models as needed. So first, we did the Discovery Accelerator, then we did some models in BPMN, in the BPMN modeler and the CMMN modeler, and DMN as we went forward. And basically, as I said, it's very simple. We just iterated and enhanced these models. One thing I had a benefit of is I had a very useful SME or subject matter expert in this content, Dr. Steve Hazley, University of Pittsburgh. He's also a member of the Association of OBGYN, ACOG, I think is the acronym. So he's an officer there. So he was able to guide me through the content. So I'm not an expert in antenatal care, but so by walking Dr. Hazley through the models or through the tools, we were able to create these models and iterate on them. So let's look at the Discovery Accelerator model. This is a high-level model, and it allows you to see and capture the entire context and scope of the topic area, in this case, a clinical pathway. It includes these elements, the activities, the actors, the artifacts, or basically data, the events, the systems, and goals, which are basically the how, the who, the what, the when, the where, and the why. So you can capture all this information. You work through it with your subject matter expert, and you define these elements in the model. And as part of our approach is we took this as far as we could, especially in terms of the relationships, before we started to do any diagramming at all. So we captured the context, tried to capture as much information, and then allow the tool to start generating some of the models for us. And as I mentioned, this also serves as the vocabulary or glossary terminology of this clinical pathway. Here's a quick picture of the Discovery Accelerator. So as I mentioned, this is a large or complex clinical pathway. The green boxes are the activities. The red ones next to them are the events. The light blue ones are the artifacts or data elements that are being used. The orange ones are the roles. The purple ones are the systems or resources that are used in the activities. And the lavender ones are the goals that can be captured for this particular set of models. So let me switch real quick to the tool. So here's the Trisotech suite, and you can see we in the server and the set of files, we have a lot of different models and files that we used for the creation of these clinical pathway. But here's quickly the the actual discovery accelerator at this stage, and we've made some changes since I think I took that picture. But it does extend. There's a lot of different, especially artifacts. We've captured a lot of different data that's collected during the pregnancy. Sonograms, exams, labs, appointments. I mean, there's a lot of different information. So all these things were captured. And from there, we did some conventions for creating these models. So each activity or green box that we saw represents a separate process or case or set of decisions within that clinical pathway. Each actor represents a set of performers or roles related to that perform the activities. So we would define all the roles of a doctor's office or a clinic and group them together. Each artifact represents a unique data element. So when we map that to the actual models, each box that we saw that was an artifact represents a BPMN data object, a CMMN case file, or a DMN decision input or output. And I'll show you those specifically as we go forward. Each event element represents a group of related events. For example, important week milestones in the course of a pregnancy. So certainly trimesters and office visits are important events that happen in a pregnancy. And each system represents a set of related resources used in the activities that are there. So you might group the office equipment together, the software are grouped together in these system elements. The next thing we did was to create the relationships between these discovery accelerator elements. And again, this is before we've done any modeling or process modeling. So the tool allows us to connect the activities. You can see the green box on the kind of lower left here on each of these examples. And you can set up the relationships between the actors, so which actor is performing these activities. You can make those assignments. You can also indicate which elements or artifacts are inputs or outputs to the activities as well. And there are lots of different types of relationships you can do between the different elements, not just these two. So we did as much of this as we could, at least from what we could understand based on what this subject matter expert knew and the documentation we had related to that. Okay, so once we've created this model of the discovery accelerator, we can start creating behavioral models from that. And I guess whenever doing this kind of modeling, you would need to choose between BPMN and CMMN to start the modeling or per each identified activity group. And there are basic rules for this. It's not going to be a hard, fast decision, but in general, you would use BPMN for more structured processes, those that have a more sequential flow of activities. And you would use CMMN for more unstructured processes. For example, you might just have a checklist of things that need to be done, but no particular sequence for this. And in general, your SME is probably going to have a pretty good idea of the general nature of those processes. So once you've made that decision, you can use the tool to export to BPMN or CMMN, depending on what you decide. But at the same time, I wouldn't agonize over this decision. As we found out, you're going to make some adjustments as you go. Sometimes we switched from BPMN to CMMN, and sometimes we were in CMMN model or case model, and we had needed to take some of that and branch off a BPMN process. So you're going to, as you iterate, you're going to make changes and make a lot more detail. So just use your best guess at the beginning and then you'll make adjustments from there. And in general, at least with the Trisotech tools, you create these models. It's kind of a one-step or one-time step. So once you've got that's why you go as far as you can with your Discovery Accelerator. Then when you're happy with that, then you can start creating your behavioral models, because you're going to drill into the behavioral models in a lot more detail and make changes which don't necessarily reflect back up to the Discovery Accelerator. And one approach you could take as you do this, especially if you're going to be creating both BPMN and CMMN models. And as an example of that, what we did, we had a process for a doctor's visit. So the patient comes in to visit the doctor, and the basic doctor visit is fairly structured. You come in, you sign in, you fill out your forms, you take your blood pressure, you wait in the office, and so it's fairly structured. So we use the BPMN to do that. But when the patient goes in to visit the doctor and the doctor does an examination, the examination itself is very unstructured. So we broke out and made a separate set of activities for the examination, which is basically a checklist of things that need to be done. And based on events that might happen, you might do different things at different times. So we needed to do both CMMN and BPMN from the high level. So what you can do in the tool is then you could start breaking up your large Discovery Accelerator model into a set of smaller ones. So each separate Discovery Accelerator creates a separate file of processes. That way, if you start drilling into the doctor visit and you realize you need to change something in the Discovery Accelerator, if you need to regenerate that process, you're not overwriting other things that you've done. And just quickly going back to the tool, so as you could see, these reddish elements are Discovery Accelerator models. The top one is the very large general model that we created, but you can see there's other ones that we created subsets, like one just for examine patient, one for consultations, etc. That way we could, as we split it up, we could start generating different types of models from them without affecting the top level model. Next. So here's an example of a smaller one. So here's actually the very top level. So if we wanted a business process for just the top level, we would have just a few steps, a few goals, a few actors, and so forth. And then we would generate that. Basically, we generate a BPMN model of this green box, and it didn't affect any of the other models that we could create. So examine patient would be a separate Discovery Accelerator model, which we could generate a case model rather than a BPMN model. You can only do one of those at a time when you export. So after you've done that, you start working on the exported processes. And the models, when you export them, is really an estimate or kind of a head start on the real process modeling effort. So the tool will create a sequence of activities based on the sequence that was placed in that box in the Discovery Accelerator. It will organize things by lanes and roles, but there aren't any decisions involved in the Discovery Accelerator, at least not defined in those activity boxes. So it just kind of gives you a head start. So you're going to have to go in and rearrange the process content and still start adding decisions and more details. So here's an example. As I mentioned, here's the doctor's office visit. So after you got started with that, you would add a lot more detail. You could add different events like waiting, waiting room. You do the process, show the inputs and outputs, the different roles, and this progresses through to the end of this process. So this is one process within the larger scope that we saw earlier. Or you could also create case models from this. And so the green box had a number of activities listed. Those would be placed into a case model. And then from there, you can start creating relationships between case files and creating the triggers to create these elements, defining whether they're required or optional, and those kind of factors can be added to the model after you've created the case. So the one reason I mentioned that it's kind of a one-time thing when you export is if you need to significantly change the Discovery Accelerator model, you add a bunch of new roles or a set of new activities that weren't there and you want to capture that in the Discovery Accelerator. If you do re-export, you're going to overwrite the changes you've made to the existing process. If you haven't made many changes, then fine, let's go ahead. You can re-export. It'll give you a new baseline to start with, but it'll have all that new content that you needed, and you can continue from there. But if you made a lot of changes and you've created a model like this, you probably don't want to re-export, even if you added a new lane or a set of new activities to this model. You would just continue working in this model and update the Discovery Accelerator in parallel. So yeah, as I mentioned, you just don't, if you made significant changes, you don't re-export. Okay, so let's start looking the relationships between the elements. So as we saw in that very large diagram, we have a lot of different models of cases and processes and decisions, and we'll take a look at what those relationships are. As I mentioned earlier, so in the doctor's visit, and that's the kind of a partial cutout of the figure on the left. Doctor visit is a BPMN process, pretty straightforward. You know, some decisions and some bouncing around between roles. In the middle of that process, you see you have an examine patient step. So as we mentioned, examine patient is once the patient's in the office, the doctor goes through a number of different steps, no particular order perhaps. And so what we can define here is a specialized task in the tool for a case. So this task calls or refers to a CMMN model, which we can see over here on the right. So this CMMN model was developed for the patient examination. And you can see that there's a number of activities. So the doctor asks questions, how's the baby moving? You know, and the doctor might do some measurements about the uterine size or other questions, review the blood pressure, and make notes about it. And also you can set up triggers so that after 34 weeks, the doctor is going to determine the fetal presentation, for example, or after the 38th week, he would or she would conduct a cervical exam. But those kind of things wouldn't happen earlier in the pregnancy. But you can set up those kind of dependencies in the case. And further, if there are exceptions, and we have a path here at the end where you can handle exceptions, like if there's high blood pressure and or there's evidence of edema, then there would be things to be done about handling that. And that's actually handled in a separate case model. So we have an optional activity over here for handling exceptions, which opens up another case model. So here we can see we went from a business process in the doctor's visit to a case model to another case, and so forth. And we can go in the other direction. Here's an example where we have a small case model, and to deal with, in this case, handling a call from the patient, we can deal with that with a kind of a small business process. So we have, in CMMN, we have this activity, which is a process task, which this refers to another a BPMN model. And these are linked directly in the tool. So if I click on this link here in the activity, I can actually open up this business process or start working on it. So this particular task, I think all 4 of these tasks in this case are kicked off if they happen, or if they don't. If they don't happen, they don't happen. But if they happen, they would kick off separate processes. So here you're going from a case model to a BPMN model. And once that BPMN model is done, you jump back into the context of the case, and other things might happen or might not, and the case could close. And so that's how you start at the very top. At the very top, you should start out with a case, the case of the particular woman in the pregnancy. So the case manages the data context and the overall life cycle of that case. Once you do the behaviors of that case, you're going to be, in this case, you're jumping back and forth between BPMN and CMMN, and also we can work with DMN, sorry. So at least with the Trisotech tool, we don't export from the Discovery Accelerator to DMN models. So these need to be created by the modeler. And you could use information from the Discovery Accelerator, or most likely you would be using the context of the process or the case to determine when you need to do a decision. So let's see, I think this second bullet is not quite right. So it should be, you can use Discovery Accelerator model activity element as a placeholder, not event element. Sorry, so that's a typo. So it's a set of activities named decisions, so you can kind of collate or collect all your decisions into a particular activity. That way you can map the inputs and outputs of that decision, but you'll need to go into the tool to create the DMN model specifically. Although not necessarily, most of the DMN decisions will probably be linked to a BPMN or CMMN task. Not necessarily, though. You could create decisions that are accessed by other decisions and not necessarily connected to the process. Yeah, and so basically, depending on the industry that you're working with, there wouldn't necessarily be a one-to-one relationship between the DMN models and the decision tasks in BPMN or CMMN. So I guess the best approach is that from DMN, you're developing these with the end result of the decisions in mind, so that the decision model could be automated by a decision engine. But in the case of antenatal care, there are some decisions that aren't really performed by engines, that are performed by the doctor. You're still going to model those. So what is the relationship then? So as you can see, here's a process on the left. This process is a kind of an exception process, basically dealing with what happens if you get a reading of high blood pressure. And that could become important in a pregnancy. So you might retake the blood pressure. You get some additional information from the patient. You know, does she have headaches or nausea or other symptoms? And then all that information gets fed into a decision. And this is in BPMN, it's a business rule task. And that is in the tool is directly linked to this DMN model. And you can see that the DMN model has some inputs, which include the doctor's questions or the answers to those questions, really. Maybe a urine protein result, blood pressure, and other information from the antepartum record, the overall data of that patient. And that feeds into a decision. And you can model that decision with a decision table, expressions, other forms to create an output. So that output is directly connected to the process and to the next steps. it's kind of cut off here, but you can see that there's a gateway that follows this decision. That gateway leads to other activities. If it's serious, you might send the patient to the hospital, or you might request another appointment to check it again, or you might request some lab test, or you might just prescribe some medicine. So depending on what happens in the decision, it affects the process directly. And so this business rule task is the link directly to a decision model. And similarly with, CMMN, CMMN has a decision task, which also can be connected to a DMN model. And that's done right there in the tool, and you can create that link and open up the different models from both the BPMN and CMMN diagrams. Okay, so we also looked at best practices. So part of the goal of the field guide and this using this use case is to inform developers of these clinical pathways so that they create consistent and shareable models so that anybody who's interested in them can use them and read them, and they would be able to recognize this is a clinical pathway developed by the Mayo Clinic and this is one by the VA and so forth, but they would all share the same style, basically. So the field guide, in a sense, is a method and style for creating these clinical pathways. So the languages of BPMN and CMMN and DMN are fairly wide-ranging. There's sometimes different ways of doing the same thing. Here we're focusing the models to have the same kind of overall look and feel across the different developers so that it creates a consistent set of clinical pathway models. So we developed a number of best practices. I won't be able to go through all of them here. It will be documented in the field guide. But for example, in every artifact that shows up in the Discovery Accelerator, a separate one of these light blue boxes would represent, would represent a separate data object in BPMN, CMMN case file item, or decision DMN input or output. And often these artifacts will have a complex structure. And there's a little bit of variability as to how much complexity do you want in the Discovery Accelerator. For example, pretty much all the data of what happens in pregnancy is stored in an antepartum record. That's the top data structure. But when you're creating your models, you don't want to have every single data object that shows up, say, on an antepartum record, and you have to drill into that data object to find, the proper vital sign and measurement that you want to use to trigger your activity. So you would use a data object called exam data, for example, and here's exam data. And that exam data should match, this is in the Discovery Accelerator here on the right, should match a BPMN data object or a CMMN case file object. You can see in both cases we're using exam data, which has a structure, and the structure has items that have their own name and type. So you have the date of exam, so it's a date type, and you have a text of the exam notes, and you have the gestation age, which is a number, and so forth. So the structure of the exam data fits into these data objects and case file items, and they should match what's in your vocabulary. And so, especially since in this particular process, which was very complex and we had lots of different models, we didn't want to have our data object to be called exam data in this process, but over in this case we call it examination data and this one here we call it examination record. We wanted the same basic core object to be labeled and have the same structure in all cases. So that's one of the best practices, is that you define this in your Discovery Accelerator and you use this as the vocabulary in all of your different models. And in the tool right now, there isn't a way to do this automatically, but those kind of capabilities will be added later. And then also, just to fill out the example, in DMN, you would also use the exact same object as an input into a decision. And here's an example of where, a different topic, but it shows that the DMN notation is not consistent with the BPMN or CMMN notations. You can see those behavioral models use kind of this document shape to represent inputs and outputs. DMN uses this kind of rounded shape, kind of rounded rectangle shape. They are, for all intents and purposes, the exact same thing, at least in the context of these modeling, and from the business analysts doing these models. It's the same thing. It's an input, and when you create expressions, use them in decision tables, or use them in gateway decisions in process, or in case expressions, they are the same thing. But the standard here uses a different notation for some reason. Also, this shape for exam data in DMN conflicts with another shape, which is called a milestone in the case model. So here's an example where the standards don't quite match. And this really illustrates that fact that a lot of different modelers of business analysts these days are going to be using all three of these standards. And if anybody out there wants to push the OMG to help put an issue in here and have this affect change to the standard, so that it will make it much easier and less confusing for the modelers. But that's kind of a separate topic. Okay, so that's really kind of what we did. Again, I can quickly show you. So we did a lot of different processes with the tool. We created a lot of different types of cases. We had the Discovery Accelerator. Here's a much more complex example of a decision. So in terms of preventing preterm delivery, there's a lot of factors that you need to deal with, and so we created a very complex set of decisions here to deal with that. Created a lot of different other case models and so forth. So as you saw earlier, it's very large and complex, but very interesting and very relevant set of models. So why did we do this? Basically, we wanted to test, really, that we could use the modeling capabilities of these three standards in describing a clinical pathway. Basically, did they work for the purpose that would serve the healthcare community? And based on the feedback we've been getting, we should consider this a success. The standards can do the job. You know, certainly there might be gaps that we could submit to the OMG. The only gap we saw was a notational gap, not a behavioral gap. So far, it looks like you know, the behavioral parts of the models work. I think we will be testing the limits of DMN and the capabilities of decision modeling, because they can be very complex in a decision in a healthcare situation. For example, deciding which type of drug to use and looking at consequences of interactions. I mean, they can be very complex decisions, and so we will kind of be able to test how well DMN really handles all of that. So this is really kind of the beginning, and but I think it's been a success so far, and we're still working on the field guide. We're still working on this use case, and that is basically it. So Um,
All
I
right.
guess we can see if there's any questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Stephen. It was really interesting. So let me get a look here. Um,
It does look like there's a couple questions that popped up. Um, so I guess you answered one. Was there going to be a replay link? Yes.
yes,
Uh,
that's it.
let's see. What
Oh, there's
is?
another one here. So how could the actual workers use this in practice?
Um, well, the workers themselves wouldn't use the models per se, but the Mayo Clinic or VA would implement these processes with the overall systems that they have, and so this would either end up being part of their workflow or part of a decision support system, et cetera. So, a doctor doesn't have to go read these BPMN diagrams, for example, but the doctor in his or her practice would be impacted by um, the systems and support that these models would help uh, define. And these are also using industry standards. They're much easier to maintain and update and so forth as we go forward. So change management will be improved. And I didn't really talk about it in that way, but that's certainly um, a, a benefit from using these standards.
Thank you. There's another question from Todd Snover again. Will this project be published separately or visible in Trisotech? And there's also a question about can these models be run as simulation?
Um, I guess that's a good question in terms of when it'd be published. Uh, so it's really the work being done at the OMG project, and in some sense, ACOG, the subject matter and the organization sponsoring the work, sometimes has some ownership of this particular use case. The expectation is that these would all be somewhat public domain, especially the ones developed throughout the OMG project and other organizations like VA. If they do these, they would be all public domain. Exactly how and where we would publish them, I think that's something we haven't worked out yet. But the plan is to allow organizations to be able to access these.
Great, thank you.
And it could be run as a simulation. Yes, there are simulation capabilities in the tool
Of
to help
course.
you run through the processes. You can
And
actually,
And so
yeah.
sorry to interrupt, but we also have another webinar that we made a couple months ago in September on process simulation. So maybe Todd, you can just go to our website in the resource section. You'll be able to find the recording of the webinar on process simulation. So maybe this can enlighten you a little bit. We have another question here from Walter. Is it worthwhile to integrate the other efforts like Arden syntax or MLM medical logical modules? These are some other efforts that I don't know about. Maybe you do, Steve?
Yeah, certainly there are kind of related and parallel efforts out there in the world. I know HL7 is doing um, work on defining clinical guidelines. So far, their work is slightly different focus, but we are aware of each other and talking about that last week. I was at an HSPC meeting where we were talking about the future of some of these standards, and certainly everybody involved with these, at least that I've worked with, are interested in collaborating and making sure we don't reinvent the wheel in different places. So we aren't there yet, but I think we, the knowledge artifacts that HL7 is creating. I don't know the MLN logical modules that well, but there's no way to prevent people from doing their own thing. But I think, at least in the healthcare community, we're trying to talk and interact and build a system that everybody can use and not override each other.
Great, thank you. So it seems like people finally had a lot of questions. So there's another one about how to acquire the software. So Selo Malazzi, I'll get back to you personally. And there's a last question that we'll take from Alexander. There are expert systems in healthcare. Maybe we see only the part of knowledge base for expert systems. What's your thought on that?
Well, I guess certainly when dealing with all the different systems that affect healthcare records and knowledge bases and so forth, the process models can help us define the touch points to these systems. So it doesn't mean that these models will recreate all the knowledge that's in these other systems, but allow the workflow or the support systems to help access them in the proper way and with the proper uh, formats. And there's other standards like FHIR, which is used to get data and retrieve data and access it and so forth. So there's a lot of different standards involved with healthcare. These three that we're talking about are just one way to help with the behavioral parts of it so that we can access and utilize all the other different information out there. It isn't intended to replace everything in the healthcare knowledge system.
All right, so I'm guessing we covered pretty much all the questions. There's another one here by Todd, which refers to the software. So I'll get back to you personally as well. So again, Stephen, this was very fun and interesting, very relevant. So thank you again for your time and for answering the questions. And if in the next few minutes people have some other questions, then you can send them directly to me, and I will, like I said, I will relay them to Stephen. All right. So thank you very much, everyone, and happy Thanksgiving for our friends in the States, and to yourself as well, Stephen.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. Bye bye.